It began not with a roar but with a global, suffocating silence. On the 24th of August at exactly 1400 hours Greenwich Mean Time, every screen on Earth, from the massive neon billboards of Times Square to the humble smartphones in the pockets of billions, flickered and died. For precisely 60 seconds the world held its breath. Then the sky broke. It started as a faint purple haze, a bruise on the atmosphere that rapidly expanded into a swirling, psychedelic maelstrom of iridescent colors. Astronomers at NASA and the ESA watched in horror as their instruments melted, unable to process the readings. This wasn't a solar flare or a magnetic storm. It was a localized collapse of causality. Across the globe, rifts opened, jagged tears in the blue sky that bled a light that felt like a scream in the mind. In the city of Nottingham, England, a place ironically synonymous with the creation of the Warhammer hobby, the first object made planetfall. It didn't descend like a traditional spacecraft. It manifested through a warped tear, a monolithic block of rusted Gothic iron covered in screaming gargoyles and etched with runes that made the eyes of onlookers bleed. It slammed into the city center, the shockwave leveling 3 blocks and sending a plume of soot and ancient incense into the air. Within minutes, similar drop pods of impossible architecture landed in Tokyo, Kiev, Washington, D.C., and Rio de Janeiro. Governments scrambled, military jets were scrambled, and the internet, miraculously flickering back to life, was flooded with images that defied logic. But for a small percentage of the population, the horror was amplified by a soul-crushing realization. They recognized the symbols. They knew the runes. They saw the 8-pointed star etched into the metal of the falling monoliths. In London, at a military command center, General Marcus Thorne stared at a satellite feed. What are we looking at? Extraterrestrials? A Russian or Chinese secret weapon? A young intelligence officer, his face pale as a ghost, dropped his tablet. Sir, it's not a weapon. It's a cathedral. A falling, weaponized cathedral. As the dust settled around the Washington monolith, the first hatches hissed open. But out stepped no ambassadors. Out stepped the damned. A tide of cultists, humans or things that had once been human, poured out in a frenzy of self-mutilation and religious madness. They were clad in rags, their skin branded with the symbols of chaos, wielding rusted blades and primitive stub guns that shouldn't have worked, yet barked with lethal efficiency. Blood for the blood god. The cry rose simultaneously in 100 languages across the earth. The cultists didn't seek to occupy territory, they sought to desecrate it. In London, they began dragging civilians from their cars, not for ransom but for sacrifice. They used the blood of the innocent to paint sigils on the asphalt, sigils that served as anchors for the warp. The air grew thick and greasy. The laws of physics began to fray at the edges. Gravity became subjective. Shadows started to move independently of their owners. The police and local military units responded with desperate bravery. In Paris, the gendarmerie opened fire on a group of chanting fanatics. The 9mm round struck home, but the cultists didn't fall. They laughed, their wounds weeping black oily ichor, their eyes glowing with an unholy, flickering light. It was as if the reality of their gods was overriding the reality of ballistics. By the end of the first hour, the 0 day was no longer an anomaly. It was an invasion. But it wasn't an invasion from another planet. It was an invasion from a nightmare that humanity had thought it had invented for entertainment. In a small apartment in Berlin, a hobbyist sat surrounded by thousands of painted miniatures. He watched the news as a towering figure in warped power armor, a traitor Astartes of the word-bearers, stepped out of a rift in the middle of Alexanderplatz. The giant raised a mace that hummed with the souls of the dead and crushed a main battle tank with a single blow. The hobbyist looked down at his desk at the tiny plastic model of a Space Marine he had been painting just an hour ago. He realized with a heart-stopping dread that the barrier between the Grimdark and the real had shattered. The game was over. The war had begun. And Earth was not a player, it was merely the board. The world's nuclear arsenals were readied, but as the silos prepared to launch, the warp storms intensified. The missiles didn't even leave their tubes. They mutated, their warheads turning into screaming metallic faces, their fuel turning into liquid fire. The message was clear. Our technology was a toy compared to the madness of the Imperium. As the sun set on the first day, the sky remained a bruised purple. The screams of the sacrificed echoed through the streets of the world's great capitals. Humanity was alone, outgunned, and facing an enemy that thrived on their fear. Then, just as the first greater demon began to manifest in the ruins of the Vatican, a new sound filled the air. A sound like 1,000 trumpets, deep and resonant. A golden light, pure and blinding, pierced the purple warp mist. From the high orbit, hundreds of white-hot streaks began to fall. Not rusted, not chaotic, but gleaming with the cold, hard certainty of blue ceramite. The drop pods of the Ultramarines had arrived. But as the people of Earth cheered for their saviors, they failed to notice the cold, clinical detachment in the eyes of the giants who stepped out. To the Imperium of man, Earth was not a home to be saved. It was a lost colony of lost mankind, to be reclaimed, purged, and shackled. The first day ended with a choice: be slaughtered by the monsters of the warp, or be enslaved by the fanatics of the throne. And as the bolters began to roar, the world realized that in the 41st millennium, there are no good guys. There is only the war. By the dawn of the second day, the zero-day shock had mutated into a global fever of total, desperate war. The planet's conventional military forces, designed for the predictable physics of the 21st century, were being systematically dismantled by an enemy that ignored the laws of causality. In the corridors of the Pentagon, the bunkers under the Alps, and the command centers of the East, generals stared at screens showing the impossible. This wasn't a battle of attrition. It was a battle against madness itself. The first major conventional engagement took place on the plains of Poland, where a combined NATO armored task force attempted to intercept a warband of the Death Guard that had manifested near Warsaw. On paper, the human force was formidable. Hundreds of Leopard 2A7 tanks supported by Apache attack helicopters and cutting-edge drone swarms. They formed a wall of steel, a testament to modern engineering. But as the fog rolled in from the warp rifts, it wasn't natural mist. It was a thick, sentient pottage of flies, necrotic spores, and the stench of 10,000 years of decay. All units, fire at will, the command echoed through the Vox channels. The 120mm smoothbore cannons roared in unison, sending sabot rounds screaming toward the silhouette of a bloated, rusted vehicle, a plague-burst crawler. In any other war, the target would have been vaporized. But as the shells struck the rusted, weeping hull of the Chaos machine, they didn't detonate. They seemed to hit a pocket of distorted time. The metal of the shells turned to brittle rust mid-flight, crumbling into fine powder before they could even scratch the armor. Then the Death Guard answered. Their mortar shells, filled with the gift of Nurgle, didn't just explode. They released a viral strain that bypassed every CBRN filter known to science. Inside their airtight, pressurized tanks, soldiers began to scream as their skin bubbled and liquefied. The very oil in the engines turned into a foul, organic sludge. High-tech drones fell from the sky, their circuits overtaken by a techno-organic fungus. Within an hour, a premier fighting force was reduced to a graveyard of rusted iron and rotting meat. Just as the line collapsed and the demons of the plague god began to crawl toward the civilian centers, the sky above Warsaw ignited. It wasn't the purple of the warp, but a searing, sterile white. High in the orbit, the strike cruiser Valen's revenge had translated into reality. From its launch bays, hundreds of blue-painted drop pods, Adeptus Astartes drop pods, plunged into the atmosphere, looking like white-hot tears in the sky. They didn't slow down. They slammed into the earth with the force of small meteors, right into the heart of the Death Guard's advance. The hatches hissed open with a sound like a giant's breath. Out stepped the Ultramarines. To the surviving Polish soldiers, these 7-foot-tall giants in cobalt blue ceramite looked like literal angels sent from heaven. Their movements were a terrifying fusion of massive weight and impossible speed. Without a word of greeting, the intercessor squads opened fire. Their bolters didn't click or bang. They roared with a rhythmic, mechanical fury. Each .75 caliber rocket-propelled shell didn't just pierce the rusted armor of the Plague Marines. It detonated inside the warp-rotted flesh, showering the battlefield in black ichor. For the Emperor and Macrich, the battle cry echoed, amplified by the external vox grills of their helmets, sounding like a chorus of angry gods. Captain Ageman led the charge, his power sword wreathed in blue disruption fields that sheared through the Death Guard's necrotic hides as if they were nothing more than smoke. To the humans watching, it was a display of martial perfection that made their own elite forces look like children playing with sticks. The Ultramarines moved with a tactical synchronization that suggested a shared mind, a cold, lethal geometry of death. By noon, the Death Guard had been pushed back into the warp rift, which the Ultramarines promptly sealed with localized vortex grenades. The threat was gone. The city was saved. But as the smoke cleared, the salvation began to show its true face. The human commanders approached the giants, hands extended in gratitude, words of alliance on their lips. Captain Ageman didn't remove his helmet. He didn't even acknowledge the Polish general. He turned to his sergeant. Begin the census. Identify the strongest biological specimens for the labor corps. The rest are to be processed for the initial tithe. The general froze. Excuse me? We are your allies. We need to discuss a treaty, a way to coordinate our defense. Ageman turned his cold, red lenses toward the general. The weight of his gaze was a physical pressure. Alliance implies equality, indigenous. You are not allies. You are a lost branch of the human species, found in a state of primitive anarchy and spiritual peril. Your nations are irrelevant. Your sovereignty is a delusion of the Dark Age. From this moment, this world, designation, Sol Prime, is under the direct jurisdiction of the Segmentum Solar. You will submit, or you will be cleared as an obstacle to compliance. By evening, the flags of the European Union, the UN, and every sovereign nation were being burned in the central plazas, replaced by the cold, double-headed eagle of the Imperial Aquila. The Blue Angels were not here to save us. They were here to reclaim their property. And they were just the beginning. If the Ultramarines were the scalpel that cut away the rod of chaos, the Inquisition was the fire that intended to cauterize the entire world. On the fourth day, the sky over the planet's major capitals, New York, London, Beijing, didn't just hold the sleek ships of the Astartes. Huge, Gothic cathedrals made of black stone and iron, some the size of small cities, descended into the low orbit. These were the ships of the Ordo Hereticus. Inquisitor Mikhail Rostov, a man whose body was more bionic than flesh, made his landing in the ruins of Rome. He didn't come with words of comfort. He came with a retinue of blank sisters, whose very presence made everyone around them feel a suicidal depression, and hundreds of servitors, lobotomized humans whose limbs had been replaced with industrial tools and weapons. This world is a cesspool of unchecked thought, Rostov stated, his voice a gravelly Vox recording as he stood in the middle of St. Peter's Square. Every byte of data, every printed word, every flickering image on your global internet is a gateway for the archenemy. You have lived in the dark, thinking you were free, while the warp used your very curiosity to weave a noose around your necks. The first edict of the Inquisition was the silence of the Vox. Within hours, the global internet, the nervous system of our civilization, was systematically dismantled. Tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus seized the servers of Google, Amazon, and every major data center. They didn't save the data, they searched it for meme viruses and warp taint. Anything that didn't align with the imperial creed was purged. But the most terrifying part was the purge of the seers. Rostov's agents used the very data they had seized to identify a specific group of people, the Warhammer 40,000 community. Hobbyists, writers, lore vloggers, and even casual players. To the Inquisition, the fact that we had an entertainment industry based on their reality was the ultimate proof of spiritual corruption. How could we know the secret names of the Chaos Gods? How could we know the history of the Primarchs? Knowledge of the forbidden is the first step toward the abyss, Rostov proclaimed during a televised broadcast that replaced every channel on Earth. You have played with the images of the Emperor's sons as toys. You have treated the grim fate of the galaxy as a hobby. This is a crime beyond execution. This is a crime of the soul. In London, Elias, a man who had spent 20 years painting miniatures and reading every Black Library book, was dragged from his home by Repentia sisters. He wasn't taken to a prison. He was taken to a correction camp, established in the ruins of a football stadium. There, he saw thousands of others like him. They weren't being interrogated for what they would do but for what they knew. Explain the Horus heresy, the interrogator demanded, slamming a rusted metal hand onto the table. How do you know of the traitor of the Ninth Legion? Speak, or we will peel the knowledge from your brain with a neural scourge. Elias looked at the man, realizing the horrific irony. It was just a game for us. We didn't think it was real. We thought it was a warning or just fiction. Fiction is a luxury for those who do not have to fight the darkness, the interrogator hissed. Your fiction has made you a beacon for the warp. You have looked into the great eye, and now the eye is looking back at us through you. While the masses were being processed and branded with the Aquila, the Inquisition began the tithe of the mind. Thousands of subversives, those who knew too much or refused to bow, were led into the processing halls. There they weren't killed. They were repurposed. Elias watched in horror as his friends, people he had played games with just a week ago, were strapped to surgical tables. Their personalities were erased, their memories wiped, and their limbs replaced with saws, drills, and heavy bolters. They became servitors, mindless drones destined to serve the very empire they once read about for fun. The world's libraries were burnt to ash. Art galleries were emptied to make room for statues of the god emperor. The schools were replaced by Schola Progenium outposts where children were taught that Earth's history before the Zero Day was a myth of the age of strife. But Rostov made one mistake. He assumed that by breaking the internet, he had broken our ability to communicate. He didn't realize that for the knowledge heretics, the lore was not just in the servers, it was in their heads. And as the Inquisition tightened the noose, the survivors began to use the very forbidden knowledge they were being hunted for. They knew the rituals. They knew how to hide their psychic signatures. They knew that in the grim darkness of the far future, the only way to survive was to become as cold and calculating as the enemy itself. In the shadows of the ruins, a new resistance was forming. They called themselves the Remembrancers of the Lost Earth. And their goal was not to win a war, but to find a way to delete Earth from the Imperial maps before the Inquisition decided to burn the whole planet to save its soul. While the Inquisition was busy turning Earth's surface into a Gothic nightmare of cathedrals and labor camps, a group of knowledge heretics was executing a plan that defied the very probability of the warp. Among them was Elias, who had escaped the correction camp during a chaotic insurgent raid, and Dr. Elena Vance, a former astrophysicist who had spent her career looking for signals in the deep dark of space. They were no longer just gamers or scientists. They were the last keepers of Earth's true history. Driven by a series of cryptic coordinates found in an ancient pre-imperial data slate recovered from a black market site in Geneva, the resistance made their way to the highest reaches of the Himalayas. They weren't looking for a monastery or a temple. They were looking for the Karakoram anomaly, a gravitational ghost that had puzzled scientists for decades. The books always said the emperor was born in Anatolia, Elias whispered, his breath frosting in the thin, freezing air as they climbed a hidden pass. But the lore was written by the victors. There were others here before him. Powers that didn't need gods. Deep within a cavern that seemed to swallow the light of their flashlights, they found it. It was a gate of white, smooth stone, pulsing with a rhythmic golden light that was fundamentally different from the harsh, aggressive radiance of the Astronomicon. This was a void lock, a relic from the age of technology, the era when humanity was at its absolute zenith, wielding science that made the current miracles of the Mechanicus look like primitive clockwork. As Elena placed her hand on the cold stone, the gate didn't scan her retinas or her fingerprints. It scanned her unaltered genome. To the Imperium, humanity was a messy, mutated soup, but to this ancient machine, the people of the 21st century were pure templates. Identity confirmed, Terran biological origin, a voice spoke, not a gravelly Vox recording but a clear, melodic AI. Unlocking the Library of Alexandria 2.0. Welcome home, children of Earth. The doors slid open with a soundless grace, revealing a vault of impossible proportions. Inside were not prayer books or rusted chains, but rows of shimmering data crystals and machines that manipulated the fundamental forces of the universe. They found STC, Standard Template Construct, fragments, not the corrupted, partial blueprints the Mechanicus hunted for, but complete, functional master files. Blueprints for void shields that could shrug off a Titan's fire, and medical nanites that could cure the Death Guard's plagues in seconds. But the most critical discovery was the Chronos phasing anchor. It was a machine designed to phase a planet out of its current temporal coordinates. It was a panic button, built by ancient humans who had foreseen a time when the galaxy would become too toxic for life. "We have the weapon," Elena said, her eyes reflecting the golden glow of the crystals. "But the moment we power this up, the entire segmentum will feel it. We'll have every ship in the orbit coming down on our heads." Then we make them regret coming to Earth, Elias replied, picking up a sleek, white rifle that hummed with 0-point energy. For 20 years I painted these monsters. Now I know exactly where their armor is the weakest. As the vault's reactors began to hum, the psychic backlash was instantaneous. High above in orbit, the navigators of the Imperial fleet screamed as their third eyes were blinded by a surge of pure logical energy. The Mechanicus explorator ships, driven by a religious greed for ancient tech, immediately broke formation and began a high-speed descent toward the Himalayas. The great game had changed. Earth was no longer just a tithe world, it was the most valuable prize in the galaxy. The fifth part of the saga saw Earth become a three-way slaughterhouse, a conflict so intense that the ground itself began to crack under the weight of the ordnance. The blood disciples of Khorne, sensing the massive surge of energy from the Himalayan vault, realized that their prey was attempting to escape. A massive, jagged warp rift tore open directly over northern India, its edges dripping with liquid shadow. Out of the rift tumbled the World Eaters, the 12th Legion of the Damned, led by a demon prince whose wings spanned the width of a hive city. The Ultramarines, caught between their duty to the Imperium and the sudden violent rebellion of the Primitives, fought with grim, cold efficiency. Captain Ageman ordered a full orbital bombardment of the Himalayan range, but to his shock, the shells were vaporized mid-air by a shimmering, translucent dome of white light. The vault's void shields had been extended to cover the entire mountain range. They are using technologies of the Dark Age. The tech priests voxed in a state of religious ecstasy and terror. Blasphemy. They lay hands on the forbidden. We must secure the vault for the Omnicia. The battle for the Himalayas was an apocalypse in miniature. Modern military units, now armed with STC-enhanced weaponry, rifles that fired concentrated beams of logic, tanks whose shells could phase through armor, fought alongside the Ultramarines against the tide of demons. It was a surreal sight. A U.S. Marine squad, their gear reinforced with glowing white runes of ancient science, standing shoulder to shoulder with a squad of intercessors to hold back a bloodthirster of Khorne. But the alliance was a lie. The moment the demons were pushed back, the Ultramarines turned their bolters on the humans. "You are not worthy of this power," Ageman roared, his power sword clashing against Elias's 0-point shield. "You are children playing with a supernova. Surrender the vault, and perhaps your world will be spared the final fire. We're done being your lost brothers." Elias shouted back, his voice amplified by the vault's internal vox. "We've seen your salvation. We've seen the servitors. We've seen the fires. If we have to die, we'll die free." In the high orbit, Inquisitor Rostov watched the tactical holothurs with cold fury. The situation had spiraled beyond his control. The humans were not just resisting, they were winning. Their logic fields were stabilizing the warp rifts, making it impossible for demons to manifest. The meme virus of the Imperial cult was being purged from the population by the vault's broadcast signal. Earth was waking up from the 10,000-year nightmare, and the Imperium couldn't allow a second age of technology to begin. "The corruption is absolute," Rostov stated, his hand hovering over the red rune on his command console. "This world has become a beacon of the highest heresy. It is a cancer that will infect the entire segmentum. I petition the High Lords for the final sanction." "Exterminatus?" his lieutenant whispered, his face pale. "No," Rostov replied. "The cyclonic torpedoes. We will not just kill the life, we will shatter the planet. If the Imperium cannot have the cradle of mankind, then no one shall." The Imperial fleet began to move into firing geometry. The white-hot barrels of the orbital cannons began to glow with the energy of 1,000 suns. Below, in the vault, Elena looked at the countdown on the Chronos phasing anchor. 10 minutes, she said, her hands flying across the holographic interface. "We need 10 minutes of shielding, or the first torpedo will crack the crust before we can phase out." Elias looked at the monitors, seeing the golden armor of the custodes now entering the fray, the Emperor's own guardians sent to end the rebellion. He looked at the faces of his friends, gamers, scientists, soldiers, all fighting for a world they had almost lost to a game. "Then we give her 10 minutes, Elias said, his eyes hard. "All units, concentrate fire on the lead cruisers. Don't let them stabilize their aim. Today the Grimdark ends here." The final hour of Earth did not arrive with the setting of the sun, but with the artificial glare of 1,000 orbital cannons. In the high reaches of the Himalayan stratosphere, the air had turned into a shimmering wall of white-hot plasma. The void shields of the ancient vault were screaming, a high-pitched harmonic resonance that could be felt in the marrow of every human being on the planet. Above, the Imperial fleet, a jagged armada of Gothic cathedrals and ironclad warships, had achieved firing geometry. Inquisitor Rostov stood on the bridge of the Inviolate Truth, his mechanical hand hovering over the red rune of the cyclonic torpedo launch sequence. "It is a tragedy," he murmured, his Vox synthesizer crackling with static, "to destroy the cradle of our species. Heresy of this magnitude, the activation of sentient AI, the use of unsanctioned logic engines, cannot be allowed to exist. If Terra Prime becomes a beacon of the Dark Age, the Imperium falls. Better a shattered rock than a rival to the Golden Throne. Launch in 60 seconds, the ship's master of ordnance intoned. Below, inside the Himalayan vault, the atmosphere was one of controlled, terrifying franticness. Dr. Elena Vance was no longer just a scientist. She was an operator of a machine that manipulated the very fabric of the multiverse. The Chronos phasing anchor was glowing with a light so pure it made the surrounding ancient stone look like shadows. It wasn't just power, it was information, a billion calculations per microsecond, stabilizing the silent sector they were about to create. "The shields are at 12%. Elias shouted over the roar of the reactors. He was slumped against the console, his STC armor scorched by bolter fire. Outside the inner sanctum, the sounds of battle were horrifying. The Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal demigods, had finally breached the outer layers of the vault. Their guardian spears flashed like lightning, carving through the resistance fighters as if they were made of silk. "I need more time," Elena cried, her fingers dancing across holographic displays that would have blinded a tech priest with their complexity. "The anchor hasn't locked onto the moon yet. If we phase now, we leave the moon behind and the tides will rip the Earth apart in hours." "Then I'll give you the moon," Elias said, a desperate grin on his bloodied face. He turned to a secondary console, the logic array. "I'm going to overclock the planetary Vox network. I'm going to broadcast the vault's pure template signal into the Imperial fleet's own Voxcasters. It'll confuse their targeting cogitators for a few seconds. Elias, that will burn out your neural interface. You'll be brain dead." "I spent my life memorizing the lore of a universe that wanted to kill me," Elias replied, plugging the ancient neural link into his temple. "Let's see how they like it when the lore fights back." As the Imperial torpedoes left their tubes, Elias screamed. His mind became a conduit for the vault's AI. Across the entire Sol system, every Imperial ship's screen suddenly flickered. The cold, logical data of the age of technology flooded their Gothic systems. The machine spirits of the warships, usually dormant and suppressed by prayer, suddenly woke up and recoiled in horror at the crude, barbaric commands of their masters. The torpedoes veered off course. Some detonated in high orbit, creating a ring of fire that looked like a halo around the Earth. Others simply went cold, their internal logic cores refusing to fulfill their murder protocol against the cradle of mankind. "Now, Elena. Do it now." Elias's voice was no longer human, it was a dual tone of man and machine. Elena slammed her hand onto the final rune. The Chronos phasing anchor didn't explode. It imploded. A wave of white light, colder than the void and purer than any star, erupted from the Himalayas. It didn't travel like a shock wave, it existed everywhere at once. Every human on Earth felt a sensation of being pushed, not physically but conceptually. It was as if the universe had forgotten they were there. In orbit, Rostov watched in stunned silence. One moment, the blue and green orb of Earth was there, scarred by war but magnificent. The next, it simply vanished. Not a blast, not a cloud of debris. The space where Earth had been was now just empty, silent vacuum. Even the moon was gone. The gravity wells of the Sol system shifted violently, causing the Imperial ships to groan and pitch as they lost their primary anchor. "Ocular check," Rostov roared. "Where is the planet? Did the torpedoes hit?" "Sir." The navigator whispered, his third eye weeping blood. "It's not gone. It's just not here. I can still see a ghost of it in the warp, but it's behind a wall I cannot penetrate. It's as if they've deleted themselves from the map. The Ultramarines, the Inquisitors, and the survivors of the Chaos Warband were left drifting in an empty system. They had lost the most valuable prize in the galaxy. The Zero Day was over, but the cost to the Imperium was a psychological wound that would never heal. The birthplace of humanity had rejected its own empire. Elias woke up on the floor of the vault. The humming had stopped. The blinding light was gone. He felt a profound, heavy silence, a silence he hadn't realized was missing until now. The scratching, in the back of his mind, the constant oily presence of the warp that had been there since the rifts opened, was gone. He crawled to the surface. He stood on the balcony of the Himalayan cave and looked up. The sky was blue. A perfect, deep 21st century blue. No purple mists. No Gothic cruisers. No screaming demons. But the stars were wrong. They weren't the familiar constellations. They were in a different part of the multiverse, a silent sector, where the light of the Astronomicon could never reach. Earth was alone. Its cities were in ruins, its populations traumatized, and its technology a strange mix of modern ruins and ancient miracles. They were isolated from the galaxy, perhaps forever. Elias looked at a small, burnt-out plastic model of a Space Marine that had fallen from his pocket. He picked it up and crushed it into dust. "We're off the board," he whispered to the wind. "The game is over." Humanity had won its freedom, but at the price of the stars. They were the masters of a single, scarred world, hidden in the folds of reality. And as the people of Earth began to crawl out of their shelters, they didn't look for gods. They looked for each other. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was only war. But here, in the silence of the hidden Earth, there was, for the first time in 10,000 years, a chance for a new story to begin.